Hi, welcome to Learning English with Pros. This is the channel where we draw on many years of university experience to provide you with reliable information on the English language and handy hints on how to improve your English. Hi, so today we're going to go for a little outing in the mountains. No, of course not. This is about an introduction to translation. And the text I've chosen is a very simple children's book, although it may be deceptively simple. But as we'll see, even these children's books do contain all the basic problems that we encounter in translation, and I'll try to explain how to solve them in a minute. So this is going to be the first in a series of videos on translation. And the aims are basically four in number. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to what I call a problem-centered approach to translation. So I'll try to highlight the general problems that occur in specific texts and that can then be transposed to producing translation solutions for other perhaps slightly more difficult texts than the one we're going to tackle today. The second aim is to demonstrate that even as a non-native speaker, you should be able to produce a perfect translation if you know how to go about it. Third aim, to explain how to use translation aids. So as we go along, I'll be pointing out how to use some of the typical translation aids found on the web. And then fourthly, we're going to look at machine translation, at how well DeepL, for instance, one of the translation engines that are freely available on the web, compare with human translation. So this is the text I want to use for today's video. As you can see, there's a piece of text, obviously, at the center. This is taken from what in Germany is called a pixie book, a small children's book with general encyclopedic information on a particular topic. In the left-hand margin, we have information on what happens, or the plants that grow at particular altitudes. This is quite important. We should keep this in mind because it will affect the way we translate particular passages. And we have illustrations that show flowers and a family that's hiking up the mountains. So this slide is meant to illustrate what I mean by a problem-centered approach to translation. I've split the entire translation commission, if you like, den Übersetzungsauftrag, as we say in German, into 6 parts or into 6 levels. The level that translation scholars normally consider first is, of course, the text level. So you want to know what type of text am I translating it here and who am I translating it for? Obviously, in our case, we're translating it for English-speaking children. The text was written for German-speaking children, so the translation commission would normally ask us to translate it for English-speaking children. So this will have a clear influence on the style we use and such like. So we need to keep this in mind. The second level we need to look at is the level of sentences, or rather the level of sentence pairs. So from now on, you should always consider sentences as pairs because they're usually related in some way. So for instance, if we have a linking word such as den at the beginning of a sentence, then this indicates that we're explaining what the previous sentence was about. We're trying to give an explanation. Außerdem means we're adding something. where this is an additive signal. So always look at sentences as pairs and never forget the preceding context when you translate the current sentence. Of course, we also have to, and that's the third level, we also have to look at the sentence internally. So if we consider the sentence to be a rhetorical unit, then for instance, je desto would be a typical signal that indicates a particular relation within the sentence. This is called a correlative normally. So if A increases or decreases, then B increases or decreases as well, and that sort of thing. Or also, which introduces a kind of reformulation normally. The fourth level I'd like to look at is vocabulary. This can be divided into two sub-areas. One is general phraseology, collocations, word combinations, for instance. In our text we have, for instance, das Wachsen erschweren and leuchtende Alpenblumen, which may be a little bit tricky to translate if you've never thought about these phrases. We'll see how to do that. And then there's, of course, terminology. This is usually quite simple. You can simply look these words up in a dictionary and you usually find the correct English equivalents. Now, level 5 is prepositions and adverbial constructions, which can be a bit tricky, not as much as in German-French translation, for instance, because in den Bergen is easy to render into English as in the mountains. What may be a little bit trickier is sehr weit oben, ganz oben, and noch in einer Höhe von. We'll see how we can translate that into English. And the sixth level is sort of not to be found in the text itself. It's outside the text. It's the kind of general knowledge that translation scholars have accumulated over the years. And in our case, for instance, this concerns the translation of starker Wind, which can't be translated as strong wind here, as we'll see. So we'll need to use a translation shift here. Also, we'll need to keep in mind that English sometimes uses a simpler style than German. So we'll have to perhaps find a slightly simpler solution, if you like, for something like erschweren, das Wachsen. And then there's the question of are we allowed to use formal words like altitude, educated words, or should we use simple words as in German, oben, and if so, how can we translate oben in this particular text? I just realized I've forgotten to read out the text to you, so I'll do that now. Welche Pflanzen wachsen in den Bergen? Je höher man in die Berge hinaufsteigt, desto weniger Pflanzen wachsen dort. Denn sehr weit oben gibt es nicht mehr ausreichend Nährstoffe. Außerdem erschweren starker Wind und Schnee den Pflanzen das Wachsen. Ganz oben halten sich nur noch Flechten und Moose, also Pflanzen, die nicht viel zum Leben brauchen. Leuchtende Alpenblumen wie das Alpenglöckchen wachsen noch in einer Höhe von mehr als 2800 Metern. Okay, I'm now going to look at some of these translation problems one by one, and I've ordered them by a degree of difficulty. This is subjective, of course, but I think we can all agree that terminology usually poses no problems. And here we can simply look up words in a dictionary, and what we find is, for instance, that Flechte is lichen in English, and Moos is moss, if we didn't know already, and Nährstoff is nutrient. So that's settled. Now, what may be slightly more difficult is terminology like Alpenglöckchen. Here we can use Wikipedia quite fruitfully by simply consulting the German entry for Alpenglöckchen, and then clicking in the left-hand column, at the bottom of the left-hand column, and we will then be redirected to the English version of Wikipedia, where we find that this soldanella, that's the formal term, is commonly known in English as snowbell. So we can use the term snowbell in our text. This is certainly more appropriate for children than soldanella. Now, another question that might arise in the context of this particular text is, how do we ask the question at the beginning of the text? Welche Pflanzen wachsen in den Bergen? As you know, there's a choice in English between what plants and which plants. In this case, I'd say the two are interchangeable. What plants is slightly more general. So you would say what plants if you assume that your readers don't know anything at all about these plants. You would use which plants if you assume that they already know a bit about plants, a bit about botany, and they might already have heard, for instance, of the snowbell and other plants that grow in their own garden, for instance. So in this case, we would prefer to use which plants. So we can say both what plants or which plants grow in the mountains. What's more difficult, and that's the third problem I'd like to tackle here, is the choice of adverbial construction. So we have a tripartite construction here that also structures the text in a way. We have sehr weit oben in the second sentence, then in a later sentence we have ganz oben, and in the last sentence we have in einer Höhe von mehr als 2800 Metern. So we could translate this as colloquially as in the German text by saying something like very high up, although that's quite rare and rarely spoken in English. We could also say far up the mountain. Very far up the mountain is perhaps not as common, but of course theoretically possible. You can always add very to another adverb or adjective. And of course we could also opt for the slightly more formal term altitude, and we'd have to use the preposition at then and say at very high altitudes. More informally, we could also use heights, and we can say at these great heights. So height is the noun, of course, derived from high. For the next two adverbials, we have two types of choices. Either we go for a text-specific choice using the comparative, because we're making a text internal comparison. So once we've said very high up, we could start the other sentence with higher still, or farther up, or as we go even further up, or at even higher levels, or closer to the mountaintop. So using a comparative because we've already used an adjective or an adverb in the previous sentence. But we could also use a superlative, which would work in any kind of context, and simply say at the greatest heights, or in the highest zones, or at the highest altitudes. These mountain areas are divided into zones. Of course, that's something you can find out by consulting parallel texts, as we'll see in a minute. The last construction, C, could be translated more or less literally by at altitudes of more than 2,800 meters, or at heights beyond 2,800 meters, or we could use the preposition above in English, which would be the most succinct way of expressing the same thing in English, saying above 2,800 meters. The next problem concerns grammatical constructions that transcend sentence boundaries, the sort of sentence external constructions I've already talked about. So in this first sentence, we have weniger Pflanzen, da wachsen weniger Pflanzen. And then the reason for this is given. This is because there are not enough nutrients. So now I've already given away what the solution is. Den is not easy to translate for most learners of English. It's a coordinated conjunction, and it's used to explain the content of the previous sentence, to provide a reason, to motivate what goes before. In English, and you won't find that in many dictionaries, this is usually translated as "this is because," or "the reason for this is that." Now, you've encountered these phrases hundreds of times, but probably you've never made the link with German "denn" yet. This is explained quite nicely in John Gallagher's book, German-English Translation, which you can see in the left-hand margin here. Now, theoretically, of course, you could also use "for," but this is a word that has now gone out of use. I wouldn't recommend using it these days. You'll still find it, of course, in literature, such as Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and so on, but it's now clearly dated and not to be recommended. You will also find these linking words in our book, Writing in English, A Guide for Advanced Learners, which is in the upper right-hand margin. This is where you'll also find information on how to translate außerdem, a linking word that's used to add information. Most German learners will fall into the trap of using moreover here or furthermore. These are far too strong for this sort of context. If you simply add a little bit of information, you use in addition, also, or more colloquially, on top of that. Slightly more difficult, perhaps, is the translation of sentence internal grammatical constructions. In this case, the correlative we've already talked about. Je höher man hinaufsteigt in die Berge, desto weniger Pflanzen wachsen dort. In English, this corresponds to three types of constructions. The one that springs to mind immediately, of course, because it's clearly related to the German construction, is the Exe, the wire. So the higher you go, blah, blah, blah. But there are two alternatives available in English. As you do something, so as you go up the mountain, or, this is again slightly more formal, with something. So we could simply say with height, or with altitude, temperatures decrease, for instance, or we could say with increasing height. So we could add the adjective increasing here. So we have three possibilities here. Flechten und Moose, also Pflanzen die. Now this is also is a linking word that's used to reword something, to introduce a more detailed restatement of the previous context. And this is usually rendered, as you'll also find in Writing in English, as I-E, I.E. which is the same thing as that is, which could also be used here. Or you could simply use a dash. This is Gedankenstrich in German. Now for the collocations in this particular text. One collocation that might pose problems is starker Wind und Schnee erschweren den Pflanzen das Wachsen. Now this has clearly been phrased for children, because normally, of course, in German we would say Wachstum, and this is also what we could base our translation on, or we could go for something simpler. What we shouldn't use is what we find in the dictionaries. So difficult, for instance, is not a good choice here, because to make something more difficult, actually Pons also indicates this, is usually used for people rather than things, objects. So, because difficult means needing a lot of effort or skill to do something, to understand something, or to work with someone or something. The better word to use here is hard, because hard can also be used in a physical sense. So we have requiring a lot of physical strength, a lot of effort. It also has the secondary meaning of unpleasant. So the first solution would be make it hard for plants to grow. Very simple solution, just paraphrasing the solution found in the dictionary. Or we could nominalize wachsen. Well, it's already nominalized. It's a deverbal derivation, but it looks the same as the verb, and it's not the same as Wachstum in German. Here we go for growth, which is the noun derived from grow in English. We could talk of plant growth, and then look for a suitable collocation in a collocations dictionary. Unfortunately, if we look this up, normally I would recommend looking it up in Osdic.com, for instance, the Oxford Collocations Dictionary for Students of English. What we find there is stunt growth, but that's not quite the same thing as erschweren, because stunt really means to block the natural normal growth, so to really stop it fully, which is not quite the same as erschweren. So what we could do, or what you could do in such a case, is look for a synonym of stunt. And for instance, in a dictionary like antidote, we find impede, hinder, etc. Hinder would be a good choice here. So plant growth is hindered by. Now the next sentence contains very idiomatic wording in German, which is halten sich nur noch Moose. It might not be such a good idea to turn to the dictionary here, because in Pons, for instance, we do find translations of sich halten, but none that can really be used in this particular context with reference to plants. So we do have hat sich gut gehalten. He has worn well. I'd also translate that as he's well preserved, but that's a different matter. Then we have sich gut halten, to do well, sich gut halten, to make a good showing, and so on, be brave. None of these work. We couldn't say the mosses are very brave. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to reword the German sentence, and we could come up with something like halten es nur noch Moose aus da oben, or halten nur noch Moose stand. And then if we could consult the dictionary again, and we'd find something like aushalten, to withstand a high temperature, for instance, eine hohe Temperatur aushalten. And we could base our translation on this kind of collocation and say something like only mosses can withstand the rigors of very high altitudes, or can withstand the harsh conditions prevailing at very high altitudes. But there are lots of difficult words in there which might not be appropriate for children. So we wouldn't use these for a children's encyclopedia. So again, we need to reword the German sentence. And the simplest way of rewording it would be können nur noch wachsen. Ganz oben können nur noch Moose wachsen, of course. And this can be easily translated into English by saying only mosses are able to grow at these heights, or in the highest zones, and so on. So that's that. And die nicht viel zum Leben brauchen can be idiomatically translated using the phrasal verb to live on something, in this case to live on very little. Or another nice phrase, also very idiomatic, is to survive on next to nothing. On next to nothing. That's well worth remembering. Finally, as far as collocations are concerned, we have the wording leuchtende Alpenblumen. This requires a little bit of lateral thinking. What does this mean, leuchtende Alpenblumen? It's not about them being illuminated by electricity or anything like that. It's about bright colors, of course. These are flowers with bright colors. So we can simply say brightly colored flowers. And a final problem that I think most Germans will tend not to notice really, and they will go wrong here and say something like the strong wind. But starker Wind und Schnee is normally translated as strong winds and snow. If you ever listen to the weather forecast in English, you will find that wind is very often pluralized in English. It's even normally pluralized, as we can see here. These are some excerpts from television programs, usually weather forecasts, where we can see that the strong winds are causing some very dangerous surf conditions. There will be strong winds and so on. So English native speakers tend to think of this kind of weather event as being not a single entity, but something that recurs and can be divided into separate events, if you like. And that's why we tend to use the plural here, especially if we talk about something that's repeated throughout the winter, for instance, in the mountains, then it's very likely for us to use strong winds. Finally, I'd recommend consulting parallel texts whenever you prepare a translation. So for instance, in this case, since the text is aimed at children, you need to consult similar texts in English, which would be children's encyclopedias, such as the Children's Illustrated Encyclopedia, which I cite here. And here you can find a phrase like higher still, which might be used in our translation as well. We might also ask ourselves whether altitude, for instance, is a word we can use in our prepositional phrases. Is this used in these children's encyclopedias? And the answer is yes, it is used. For instance, in the entry on tea cultivation, we do find at altitudes of 3,000 to 7,000 feet. Another question concerns the use of above as a preposition, and we can see here that we have a phrase in an original English text of the type can even grow above 1,500 meters elevation. Elevation being a very formal equivalent for altitude. It's more precise, it's used by geographers, but we wouldn't want to use it here in a text intended for children. Another question I was wondering about is whether we can use very high up, which is very informal, but it's found in series that talk about nature. So here, for instance, we have an example from a series called Raw on the BBC. But they do try and live somewhere near water so they can cool down. They don't live very high up. They don't live up in mountains because it will be maybe too cold and not enough prey for them to eat. So this is exactly the kind of context we need. This is about mountains, and very high up is used on its own as a kind of substitute preposition, traditionally called, of course, an adverbial. And we can also use far up the mountain. There's another example here taken from another text. So this will give us the following translation, which I'll take you through sentence by sentence now. Welche Pflanzen wachsen in den Bergen? Which plants grow in the mountains? Je höher man in die Berge aufsteigt oder hinaufsteigt, desto weniger Pflanzen wachsen dort. 5 possibilities. The higher you climb up the mountains, the rarer plants become, or the fewer plants there are, or the less vegetation there is, or the less vegetation can be found, the fewer plants can be found, and so on. Second version, as we walk up the mountain, plants become scarcer. Scarce is a very good word to remember here. As we go further up the mountain, plants become scarce. We don't necessarily need to use the comparative here. We can also say simply scarce. And here we have this other correlative construction with increasing height, with increasing altitude, or even in a context that would be intended for adults, with increasing elevation, plants become rarer. Or simply, this is probably the simplest solution that might be intended for 4-year-olds, the higher you go. Denn sehr weit oben gibt es nicht mehr ausreichend Nährstoffe. This is because there aren't enough nutrients at high altitudes. The reason for this is, or simply the reason is, that at great heights there aren't enough nutrients. The reason for this is that at these great heights, we already know that we find ourselves at a great altitude, so we can use the demonstrative pronoun these here. Or more colloquially, the reason is that very high up, very far up the mountain, or far up the mountain, there are not enough nutrients. Außerdem erschweren starker Wind und Schnee den Pflanzen das Wachsen. Ganz oben halten sich nur noch Flechten und Moose, also Pflanzen, die nicht viel zum Leben brauchen. In addition, plant growth is hindered by strong winds and snow. This is fairly easy to understand even for a 6-year-old because grow is very similar to growth. And hinder is a very basic word of Germanic origin. But the second sentence will be even simpler, of course. Also, strong winds and snow make it hard for plants to grow. Now for the second sentence. At the highest altitudes, you'll only come across mosses and lichens, i.e. plants that can survive on next to nothing. Or higher still, farther up, as we go even further up, at even higher levels, closer to the mountaintop, at the greatest heights, in the highest zones, only mosses and lichens are able to grow, plants that live on very little. Or a solution I forgot to mention earlier, you can turn, you don't need to use a prepositional phrase here necessarily. You can turn the German adverbial into an English subject and say the highest zones, and then use a verb like contain or harbour. The highest zones harbour or contain only mosses and lichens. That's a variant, and it's quite neat because it's much shorter, much more compact than the German sentence. Now for die leuchtenden Alpenblumen. Leuchtende Alpenblumen wie das Alpenglöckchen wachsen noch in einer Höhe von mehr als 2800 Metern. Brightly colored alpine flowers like the snowbell can be found at heights beyond 2,800 meters. Or vibrantly colored alpine flowers, or alpine flowers with vibrant colors like the snowbell, can even grow at altitudes of more than 2,800 meters or above 2,800 meters elevation. Finally, let's compare our solution with that produced by DBell. If you feed that into DBell on the web, which I've just done, this is the solution that it comes up with. The higher one climbs into the mountains, we don't climb into the mountains, so that's slightly problematic. Also, the use of one is rather old-fashioned. And of course, what DBell doesn't really realize is that the text is taken from a particular text type, namely a children's encyclopedia, and using one in a text intended for children is not the right kind of choice. The higher one climbs into is clearly wrong. The fewer plants grow there. That's illogical because our climbing doesn't affect the number of plants. So it would be more logical to say the fewer plants there are, but not the fewer plants grow there. The next sentence starts with because. We don't normally start a sentence with because, and the normal way of doing this, as we've discussed, is this is because there are not enough nutrients. Very far up in the mountains, well, sehr weit oben, that's not wrong, but we've found better solutions. That's why I've marked it in pink here. It's not totally wrong, but there are better solutions than this. In addition, strong winds, that's a good choice. Strong winds and snow. The computer, obviously, this is easy for a computer to do because what the computer simply does is compare the combination of wind and snow, and it's got hundreds of examples at its disposal, and what it will find quite easily is that snow and wind often collocate in this type of constellation where we have strong winds in the plural. So strong winds and snow make it difficult for the plants to grow. I'm not quite happy with the here, although it might be assumed that we already know what plants we're talking about, we're sort of familiar with plants. Still, a more general approach would be more likely, and that would mean using just plants, not the plants. Difficult, we said difficult is not a good choice for various reasons, which I'm not going to go into again now. At the top is wrong because we're not talking about the summit. It says ganz oben in German, but of course at the top we don't have anything. Nothing usually grows at the top of high mountains. Do not need much to live on, that's okay. Certainly alpine flowers are not luminous. That's clearly a wrong choice, which would suggest something like electricity. And Alpenglöckchen is not an alpine bell, and it does not still grow. It does not continue to grow at an altitude. It only grows at that particular altitude. So the use of still is wrong here. So a pretty poor performance by DeBell, I'd say.